What if I told you that the bishop had nothing to do with Joel Tudman's abrupt dismissal? For weeks, social media became a courthouse, rumors proliferated like wildfire, and headlines blamed others. However, the reality behind the scenes is much more nuanced and startling than anyone anticipated. Because you have been misinformed about the true reason Joel Tudman was removed. And you'll see why so many people wanted this story to be forgotten once you hear the specifics. The abrupt dismissal of Joel Tudman surprised thousands of followers and rocked the religious community. Almost immediately, rumors started to spread, with many accusing the bishop and other officials. However, the reality is that this situation is very different from what many had thought. Most individuals were unaware of the meetings, discussions, and hidden elements that took place behind closed doors. We're going to take a closer look today and show you why Joel Tudman was fired. And trust me when I say that the way people think has nothing to do with the bishop. You will actually begin to perceive a much deeper story once the facts are presented. One that entails power battles, divergent viewpoints, and choices taken in secret. Keep reading, because the information I'm going to provide you will not only alter your perspective on this tale, but also prompt you to consider how church leaders nationwide handle similar circumstances. It becomes intriguing at this point. We must first examine Joel Tudman's identity inside the church and the reasons his presence was so significant before we can comprehend the turmoil surrounding his expulsion. Joel Tudman was more than just a speaker or a mere presence on the podium. He served as a link between the future generation, which was looking for something new, genuine and accessible, and established church ideals. His voice struck a chord with younger audiences. Tudman had been establishing a solid reputation for years for his impassioned preaching, open communication, and capacity to engage people more deeply. Tudman welcomed vulnerability in contrast to many executives who adopted a strict, formal style. He talked candidly about faith in the contemporary society, acknowledged his own hardships, and frequently addressed topics that other pastors shied away from. He seemed genuine to many, like a preacher who was aware of the stresses of daily living. His impact expanded both online and within the church. Social media users began sharing clips of his messages, attracting new followers who might not have otherwise entered a traditional sanctuary. Because of his online presence, he was able to establish himself as one of the most powerful young leaders in his community. And people were aware of its influence. Influence, however, has two sides. Every action you take is scrutinized more intently the more people admire you. And that fame was both a boon and a bane for Joel Tudman. Supporters were excited by his ascent, but some were uneasy because they thought his expanding platform was drawing focus away from the core leadership. Joel Tudman wasn't only regarded as a supportive leader by the time he was well established. He was emerging as a key figure. Additionally, that kind of growth frequently causes conflict in organizations that place a high priority on hierarchy and control. This is where things become fascinating, though. The grounds for Tudman's departure were developing long before any public announcement, despite the widespread belief that the bishop was the primary motivator. Behind the well-rehearsed sermons and happy pictures, there were silent meetings, whispered discussions, and mounting worries that would culminate in one of the most startling removals in modern history. The hidden tensions that no one wanted to discuss are the subject of the following chapter. There are always dynamics at work behind the scenes whenever a figure in a church or other major institution climbs to prominence. Joel Tudman believed that those dynamics were developing long before the general public noticed any indications of problems. There were discussions in leadership circles that presented a very different picture, even while he was winning hearts in the sanctuary and growing clout online. The sense of alignment, or rather misalignment, was one of the earliest indications of tension. Although Tudman's style appealed to younger viewers, it wasn't necessarily consistent with the institution's historic voice and culture. His tactics were deemed too audacious, too unorthodox, or even dangerous by certain leaders. Friction is practically a given when innovation is combined with an organization that prioritizes stability and order. Concerns regarding attention were also present. Joel Tudman's expanding platform started to draw attention in a world where social media presence frequently means just as much as pulpit presence. Conversations outside of Sunday mornings were being sparked by his sermon clips, which were receiving thousands of views. This was a victory for many. It indicated that a wider audience was being reached by the church. Others, however, perceived it as a change in focus. There was more attention focused on one man than on group leadership. Additionally, even inadvertently, a rising star's appearance might occasionally feel like a threat in highly structured leadership structures. An additional source of conflict resulted from disparate ministerial scions. In ways that weren't always convenient for everyone, Tudman frequently discussed overcoming barriers, tackling contemporary challenges, and relating faith to pressing concerns. Many found his openness refreshing, but others found it unsettling. Control over the story is frequently preferred by traditional leadership. However, Tudman's approach encouraged unvarnished honesty from both himself and the audience. Not everyone is comfortable with that level of transparency. Then there were the murmurs, the backroom talks, the leadership meetings, and the gradual accumulation of inquiries. Was the group mission being overshadowed by Joel Tudman? Did the core leadership not entirely agree with the direction his influence was taking? Most significantly, did he completely conform to the system of power that oversaw everything? These elements together to create pressure, such as a pot on a burner, slowly heating. Everything appeared to be in order. Joel Tudman was motivating, guiding, and preaching to a large number of people. However, those who were familiar with the inner workings saw a change. Leadership meetings had a different vibe. Conversations started to take on a different tone. And gradually, the gap between reality and perception widened. However, here is the unexpected part. The public story did not align with the private narrative when the time for removal eventually arrived. Rather, a more straightforward narrative emerged, claiming that the bishop had called for it to be merely a question of authority. Was it really that simple, though? Absolutely not. The reality is much more complex, encompassing more individuals, choices, and tactics than anyone wanted to acknowledge. There is a breaking point in every story like this, just one instance in which private discussions result in decisions that are made publicly. A single big affair that made news wasn't the tipping point for Joel Tudman. It was the result of stress that had been subtly building for months or perhaps years. According to people close to the incident, the atmosphere was gradually getting intolerable. Small arguments over leadership style and vision gave way to more serious issues with authority, loyalty, and alignment. Although many people respected Tudman, some in the leadership started to wonder if the current system could handle his expanding power. In short, there was a concern that his platform had grown too strong to manage. A private meeting served as the last catalyst. Several reports claim that this was a high-level meeting where challenging topics were discussed rather than a light-hearted banter. Did Joel completely agree with the church's desired course? Was the group's objective starting to take a backseat to his own brand? Above all, could he be relied upon to maintain his position of authority while expanding his power? According to reports, Tudman made a strong case for his stance. He maintained that his goal was to reach those who had long been cut off from the church, not to amass a personal empire. He made it clear that his openness and approach were relevant rather than rebellious, a means of bringing faith to people who had grown disinterested in conventional preaching. However, his remarks did not allay the worries in a setting where perception occasionally mattered more than intention. Thus, the choice was made. The official statement was meticulously constructed to sound controlled, clean, and most importantly, polite. To lessen the impact, terms like new season and transition were employed. However, those who had been listening were aware that this was not only a minor adjustment. This was a breaking point, a separation, and a removal. As soon as the news reached the public, shockwaves started to spread. Some followers were even irate and perplexed. Questions, presumptions, and, of course, accusations erupted on social media. The most straightforward explanation that people could easily understand was that the bishop had off the power. People had a face to associate with the choice and an authority figure to blame thanks to that story. That was never the whole truth, though. The bishop ended up being the target of criticism. However, individuals with inside knowledge realized that he wasn't the only one who made the choice. Board talks, internal tactics, and pressure from the entire leadership team were the causes. Indeed, others contend that the bishop just served as the public face of a decision that had already been made long before he gave his approval. Joel Tudman saw the removal as a watershed moment. Although he maintained his cool in front, it was obvious that this was a terrible blow behind the scenes. Following years of duty, commitment, and development, he was unexpectedly thrown into a whirlpool of conjecture. Was he fired due to a scandal? Was it envy? Or was it just politics at work in a place that prioritizes tradition over creativity? This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, though. Joel Tudman's removal was actually due to more than just his popularity or leadership style. Beyond that, it delved into the kind of calculated actions that the general public rarely hears about. Actions that demonstrate the extent to which politics may affect even places of worship. The public typically only hears the well-crafted justification when someone like Joel Tudman is removed. Phrases like a change in calling, a new season, or a period of transition are meant to seem uplifting and innocuous. However, underneath that exterior, there are frequently more complex and messy causes. Furthermore, the truth in this instance shows a side of church leadership that many people are unaware of. There was more to Tudman's dismissal than a single incident or a sharp decline in popularity. Contrary to rumors, it was not about scandal. More significantly, it wasn't only because the bishop chose to interrupt him. Rather, it was about strategy, control, and safeguarding the system of power that runs everything from the boardroom to the pulpit. Joel Tudman's increasing power, you see, was a sign of both possibility and danger. Questions, presumptions, and, of course, accusations erupted on social media. The most straightforward explanation that people could easily understand was that the bishop had off the power. People had a face to associate with the choice and an authority figure to blame thanks to that story. That was never the whole truth, though. The bishop ended up being the target of criticism. However, individuals with inside knowledge realized that he wasn't the only one who made the choice. Board talks, internal tactics, and pressure from the entire leadership team were the causes. Indeed, others contend that the bishop just served as the public face of a decision that had already been made long before he gave his approval. Joel Tudman saw the removal as a watershed moment. Although he maintained his cool in front, it was obvious that this was a terrible blow behind the scenes. Following years of duty, commitment, and development, he was unexpectedly thrown into a whirlpool of conjecture. Was he fired due to a scandal? Was it envy? Or was it just politics at work in a place that prioritizes tradition over creativity? This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, though. Joel Tudman's removal was actually due to more than just his popularity or leadership style. Beyond that, it delved into the kind of calculated actions that the general public rarely hears about. Actions that demonstrate the extent to which politics may affect even places of worship. The public typically only hears the well-crafted justification when someone like Joel Tudman is removed. Phrases like a change in calling, a new season, or a period of transition are meant to seem uplifting and innocuous. However, underneath that exterior, there are frequently more complex and messy causes. Furthermore, the truth in this instance shows a side of church leadership that many people are unaware of. There was more to Tudman's dismissal than a single incident or a sharp decline in popularity. Contrary to rumors, it was not about scandal. More significantly, it wasn't only because the bishop chose to interrupt him. Rather, it was about strategy, control, and safeguarding the system of power that runs everything from the boardroom to the pulpit. Joel Tudman's increasing power, you see, was a sign of both possibility and danger. This was the bitter truth for Tudman. He had grown too large, too powerful, and too self-reliant. His dismissal was not a kind of discipline. It was a preventative measure. averting what the leadership perceived as a possible change in authority. However, this begs a far more important question. For leaders like Joel Tudman, who must balance genuine service with negotiating the politics of influence, what does this suggest for the future of church leadership? As soon as Joel Tudman's dismissal was ultimately made public, the response was swift and explosive. Many members of the church body were in shock and found it difficult to comprehend what had just transpired. The explanation didn't make sense to normal members who looked up to Tudman. They had not observed any indications of scandal or errors that would have called for such an abrupt shift. They had only witnessed a man fervently preaching, establishing connections, and gathering support. Social media emerged as the initial response platform. Within a few hours, posts began to circulate. Why did Joel Tudman actually get kicked out? What went wrong for him? Is this the bishop's doing? These were not only pointless inquiries, they were exclamations of perplexity and annoyance from those who felt taken by surprise. It was more than just perplexity for some, it was heartache. Members felt as though they had suddenly lost a spiritual mooring after discovering hope, healing, and even faith through Tudman's work. However, the way narratives started to diverge was what gave the aftermath even greater impact. In support of the church's decision, others pointed to leadership obedience and alignment as the reasons why such changes occasionally occur. Skeptics' voices, on the other hand, insisted that there must be a deeper, more political factor at work. Tension was brought about by this division not just within the church, but also among the general public who were observing from outside. Joel Tudman, meantime, made a dignified decision. Rather than ranting or snapping, he maintained his composure. Even though those closest to him were aware of the grief he was experiencing, he spoke of faith, thankfulness, and moving on in his remarks and appearances. The esteem that many already had for him was only strengthened by this cool-headed, collected response. His silence was a powerful message to them. It was strength, not weakness. There was another revelation from the aftermath. How powerful Tudman had become in such a short period of time. Leaders, pastors, and members from all over the nation started to voice their opinions, even outside of his church. Some people sent encouraging messages. Others used the incident as a wake-up call to consider how leadership is managed in their own organizations, while others implicitly discussed the perils of church politics. However, the most telling response was from regular people. This was more than just a change of leadership for them. It was intimate. They weren't inquiring about the church's fate. They wanted to know what would happen to us if Joel Tudman's voice were gone. Unanswered questions, and that sense of loss led to even more conjecture and discussion. The plot then takes an even more intriguing turn at this point. Because even though Joel Tudman lost his job, the fallout didn't stop him from speaking up. It made him louder. His impact remained constant. It moved. People started to pay closer attention to him, anticipating his next action and his next statement. In actuality, what the leadership may have perceived as the close of his time in the church marked the start of something new. The rippling effect of this reaction hasn't completely subsided yet, and it begs the more important question. Did the church's choice to fire him enhance rather than weaken his position?